Bien, bonjour et
Hello and welcome everyone once again to this amphitheater, Marguerite de Navarre at the Collège de France. I must admit that I thought until the very last minute that I would literally not be able to attend. As some of you may know, my husband has been waging a heroic battle against a very serious case of cancer for almost 2 years now. Unfortunately, it is now that cancer that is now winning the battle. Even more so than last year, when I gave my lectures as best as I could, given the circumstances. This year is a year placed under the sign of precarity and fragility. Precarity in the sense of human fate and the fragility of the human condition. Nevertheless, it's an unsuspected source of vital energy and human ties. These are all themes that will find their echo in this year's lectures if they do take place. You would be entitled to ask yourselves, why, given the circumstances, given the conditions, be stubborn? Aren't you stubborn in wanting to launch out into a new series of lectures, which obviously could not have been prepared under normal conditions? That's the least one could say. Lectures that may border on inconsistency, and there I beg your indulgence. And above all, lectures that may stop at any point in time. Quite recently, I had an experience of such an interruption that was totally unexpected as I received our guest lecturer from the University of Tokyo, Professor Kobayashi, whom I had to abandon to his fate during one of his lectures. So yes, it is a form of obstination, one could say. Obstination that is not even therapeutical. Quite the opposite. It's the strong desire to wish to combat illness and even an announced end which may be nigh. Perseverance, too, in wishing to, at all costs, preserve ties with the community of the living as you are. A community formed of all the invisible surfers on the internet following these lectures. I know that there were many of you who accompanied me over these years in my lectures, expressing your sympathy and your support in many different forms. I truly have the feeling that I do not have the right to leave the conversation that we have initiated. I will therefore try to maintain it and nourish it as much as I can. Nevertheless, I'm sure that you have understood that this conversation may be continued along dotted lines or even interrupted in the coming weeks or even coming days. So more than ever before, I cannot recommend to you too much to very regularly consult the Collège de France website to keep informed in real time about any possible announcements of cancellations or postponements. Let me also remind you that the lectures at the Collège de France for this year and the previous years, these lectures may be followed and downloaded free of charge in audio and in video format in French and in English, and in Chinese for my lectures, downloaded on the Collège de France's website. My web page on this site should also be consulted by those who are interested in our seminar on Thursday afternoon, where we will continue this year to read commentaries on the Chao Yi, namely on the Book of Changes in the Song time. You may understand that this seminar is reserved normally for those who read not only Chinese, but classical Chinese preferably. So I draw your attention to any followers of the seminar to the fact that everything has changed. The forum, the date, the timetables. So this seminar is now held not here at the Marcellin Berthelot Amphitheater, but on the website at the site of Collège de France at 52 Rue du Cardinal Lemoine, which is also where you find the Orientalist Library for the Collège de France, and also the Library of Higher Chinese Studies in particular. This seminar will resume this afternoon at 3 p.m. It will be held only once every 2 weeks and over a 3-hour period instead of 1 hour 30. So from 3 to 5 p.m. as of today, meaning that next Thursday there will be no seminar, but on the 20th of December there will be again a 3-hour seminar just before the holiday season for Christmas. Before getting down to the heart of our topic for this year, I believe it would be a good idea for myself, first and foremost, I believe, for those of you who have been following us for years, and especially for those who are joining us now, I believe that we should begin by recalling the path we have covered together until now. The adventure started 4 years ago now, and this adventure consisted in revisiting, or rather in many different revisits of Confucius and of the text of the Analects associated with him, with a constant concern to keep both ends together. What I mean by that is to show more or less ancient processes as regards composition and interpretation of the text, and at the same time, without ever forgetting to place it in light of contemporary challenges. I believe that quite simply by reading the newspapers or the media, you have all realized that there is a current return of Confucius. Our work here at the Collège de France consists in setting a distance and being critical of this phenomenon. And this is why we have the title of this cycle of lectures that lasted for 4 years, Confucius Revisited. Ancient texts, new message. This is how we started in the first year, 2008-2009, which was when I was initiated in a way at the Collège de France. When I think that I'm still alive 5 years later, well, during that first year, the starting point was precisely the contemporary situation today of what I just called the return of Confucius in mainland China primarily, a massive phenomenon affecting many sectors and stratas in Chinese society. This is all the more spectacular when one considers that it is quite the opposite of what was observed just one generation ago in the 70s, where what prevailed was the wish to achieve a massive destruction of all the Chinese traditional heritage and Confucian as a result. On several occasions, I've already shown to you the sharp contrast in images between what took place in the 70s. As you can see here, the Red Guard officer demolishing a part of the Confucius temple in Chufu, the birthplace of Confucius. And here we see a picture of the Beating Beacon campaign, a critical campaign against Lin Biao, the enemy that Mao Zedong had decided to destroy. A campaign, therefore, against Confucius. That campaign was led in 1974. And the sharp contrast with this statue of Confucius replaced on its pedestal. It dates back, it was about 40 years later on. The statue was erected, as we can see, on the pedestal in 2001 at the entrance to the campus of the People's University, Lamintashire, in Beijing. The People's University, which may I recall, is the former training school for the management staff in the Communist Party. Here you also have a clear sign of Confucius's return and the return of the Analects with the picture of this young girl holding a copy of the Lun Yu, meaning the Analects. And in vertical, the question being, have you read the Lun Yu? You also have another eloquent picture as regards the return of Confucius. That's not only for the happy few, but it goes deep down into the social fabric. Here you find a school with very young children, with a master inculcating the teachings of the old master, and here you find a portrait of him here, a school located in the remote areas of China. It's a very modern picture. So within just one generation, we have moved from one extreme to the opposite extreme. In this return of Confucius, we also see a sudden renewed interest in the Lu Yu, often translated as the Analects, and which is now a bestseller in Chinese bookstores to such an extent that you would almost forget to what extent this text has been criticized or even burnt during the famous campaign in 1974. I showed you some pictures of that earlier. Here you find the cover page of a bestseller that was sold in tens of millions of copies in China. The book by Miss Yu Tan, her name appears here, and she entitled her book Lu Yu Xin De, meaning literally what I have learned from the Lu Yu. This Miss Yu Tan, you can see that she's a very pleasant face, someone who in actual fact is not an academic, nor is she an expert on ancient texts or even on Confucius. In actual fact, she's an expert in communication, and she was a major success with her book. I believe it was translated into French under the lenifying title of, I think, A Small Treatise on Happiness According to Confucius, or something of that sort, a book that I certainly would not recommend. As a matter of fact, history revenged itself in that Mrs. Yu Tan's book immediately led to a lot of uproar amongst certain colleagues from academia who responded with this sort of pastiche entitled Konshi Hanchaozi, meaning Master Kong, that is Confucius, has every reason to be worried. And this pastiche was doubled by another work bearing on another master in ancient China, and this pastiche was entitled therefore Cheng. He has every reason to be angry. So there are two titles that rhyme. In fact, both titles rhyme, coming from the opponents of this Miss Yu Tan, whom they accuse. I'm reading what I'm seeing on the cover page of this pastiche of making chicken stew for the soul. We recently learned that Miss Yu Tan was invited to give a lecture, the 1,000th lecture in her track record, and against all expectations, she couldn't even take the floor, and she was obliged to leave the auditorium, booed by the audience. Of course, that's something that no lecturer would like for himself or herself. Before moving on to the many questions or questions still raised by the Analects, I thought it would be important to plot out in a sort of genealogical survey moving from today to ancient times, to look at the various ways of reading that informed our current way of viewing and considering this text and its history. When we read the Luyu, or whenever we talk about it, we have certain presupposed ideas that are supposed to be a give to such an extent that we are no longer even aware of that. It seems important, therefore, to explicit all of these preconceived ideas and to clearly see where they are coming from. They come from the long interpretative and exegetic tradition in China, of course, but also, as we have seen in our lectures in 2009, 2010, in the second phase, it's due to the way this text and other texts in the Confucian canonical corpus was presented for the first time to European readers, thanks to the mediation and translations carried out by Jesuit missionaries in the 17th and 18th centuries. This mediation by the Jesuits, which gave rise to what I called the first moment of the globalization of Confucius, led to the fact of giving to Europeans a portrayal of Confucius as a rationalist and philosopher who was quite in line with ideals in the Renaissance period, especially for Jesuit missionaries, and who was then brought in line with the ideals in the days of the European Enlightenment. Here you have the title page of the Confucius Sinarum Philosophus. Confucius, therefore, a philosopher for the Chinese. So it's the word philosophos. A philosopher, therefore, which is used as the main description of Confucius. A monument in terms of translation that was published in Paris in 1687 at the end of the 17th century. This was under the reign of Louis XIV, and this translation was published under the royal patronage here in the genitive Ludovici Magni, in other words, Louis the Great. And this is the fruit of years of work by a whole consortium, one could say, of Jesuits in Europe. So this is truly a monument that was a milestone, and it was retranslated into English by a contemporary Jesuit, a French national, Thierry Ménard, who came a few years ago, by the way, to the Collège de France to speak about this work. Along the same lines, the Analects, the Luyu, this text was translated and read along the lines of ancient Greek texts. Confucius was presented as a philosopher's sinarum, while the Analects were presented as a form of Socratic dialogue. Now, this description, a philosophical description of Confucius and the Analects, as we have seen, continued despite the rejection of China outside of the sphere of philosophy by Europe in the 19th century, as we have seen 2 years ago. And therefore, this philosophical description is in itself, back and more than ever before, is a burning issue that is quite topical today. As we have seen in our lectures in the following year, in 2010-2011, the third round of lectures, we saw a radical change. I'm so sorry, I'm coming back. I forgot to show you the portrayal by the Jesuits of this Confucius as philosopher. And strangely enough, we find it in iconographic official portrayals of Confucius in China today. We have several Chinese purists who are angry at the fact that the official picture of Confucius, might I say, in modern Chinese population is very much reminiscent of the Jesuits' Confucius. So I was saying that in the third round of lectures we were able to note a radical change which took place in this philosophical description, since we moved in the meantime from a European tradition to an American tradition, a much more recent tradition with the American pragmatist trend. The small book that you are seeing here with its cover page, written by the American pragmatist philosopher Herbert Fingeret, is entitled Confucius, the Secular as Sacred. Confucius, the Secular as Sacred. It was published in 1972. You will note the concomitance that's quite striking between the date of publishing of this book by Fingeret and the high season of the Cultural Revolution in China, while Confucius was being demolished physically with hammers in China. An American philosopher was busy attempting to bring Confucius back into fashion. And this has truly revolutionized our way of viewing the Analects, which are no longer viewed as the ancient and exotic teachings of a sort of Chinese Socrates with a dual exotism in terms of space and time, but a way of viewing this text, approaching the text, which quite the opposite, according to Fingeret, has, according to him, something new to teach us. Something new to teach us. To teach us, we who live in the Western world in the modern times, namely at the end of the second millennium, but this is a book that still speaks to us at the start of the third millennium. And yet this something that Confucius would have to teach us is linked to the ritualized nature of all human relations, and more broadly speaking, all humanity. Fingeret here calls upon the ancient Chinese term, which you can see on the cover page of his book, which is Li, and which designates generically rights, and which we'll come back to examine this year, if Confucius lends me life. And during these two moments, one European and the other, the second moment, which was American, we have since moved on to the from one globalization of Confucius to another. In other words, from a first globalization conveyed in Latin in Europe until the 18th or even the 19th century. From this first European globalization, we have shifted to a second globalization, conveyed this time in the English language, in the new lingua franca, the new communication language at international level in the world in the post-Second World War period. We have also moved from one paradox to another. The first paradox resided in the way the Jesuit missionaries portrayed an agnostic Confucius, enabling them to accommodate, to use the Jesuits' term, to accommodate Christian faith with Chinese culture for the Confucian elite. It was essential indeed for the Jesuits to show, and this was precisely the famous quarrel of rights that took place in around 1700, to show therefore that Confucian rights were in no way religious. These were purely civil rights, to be able to assert that they were perfectly compatible with the Christian worshipping of a single God. And yet this paradox, cultivated by the Jesuit strategy of accommodation, turns around entirely in the pragmatist view of a figurehead, for whom it is precisely the secular nature of Confucius which gives to human relations a nearly religious quality, by rendering the human sacred in its relational qualities. And all of this is the meaning of this character Li, meaning rights, on the cover page of Fingeret's book. So 3 centuries after Confucius Sinarum Philosophus by the Jesuits, and nearly a half a century after Confucius the Secular as Sacred by Fingeret, we could consider that time had come for a third globalization of Confucius. Indeed, we are witnessing an interesting movement between two totally reverse movements. One, the reconstruction or reinvention of Confucius that can be noted today in mainland China. And the other movement is quite the contrary, a movement of deconstruction of Confucius as a figure and of the Analects by Confucius, a deconstruction process which is gaining ground, especially amongst Western sinologists, meaning Europeans and Anglo-Americans. We saw this last year, even though it may take on radical shapes. This deconstruction movement, and I must point this out straight away, should above all not be confused with destruction trends or demolition trends of Confucius and of Confucianism, which occurred during the Chinese 20th century. You may think in particular of the destructive paroxysm 1 century ago with the iconoclastic movement of the 4th of May 1919, and we just recall this a half a century later with the Cultural Revolution from 1960s, 1970s. And in that respect, we can consider it as being a sort of revival of the movement of the 4th of May, but even more radical, violent, and destructive. Quite the opposite. Whereas, quite often, the destroyers of yesterday were 20 years old in 1970, and they sought at all costs to demolish Confucius. These are the same destroyers that we are finding today, wearing the suits of reconstructors who are the most zealous of the lot. And here we have a sort of turnaround, which we find quite often amongst the same individuals. You take them at age 20 in the 70s, they're against Confucius, and you find them 40 years down the road or 50 years later on, and the same people are putting the statue of Confucius, more or less borrowed from the Jesuits as a matter of fact, putting it back on its pedestal. As for the deconstructors, it's quite a different story. Most of them are experts outside of recent Chinese history, since this is the world of academia in most cases, in Western universities, as I said earlier. As a result of this rehabilitation effort conducted by the reconstructors, at the same time as Confucius, and I'm sorry for the pun, but Confucius once again finds his status and statue of being an iconic text. The text once again becomes a canonical text, and as a matter of fact is promoted to the rank of a sacred text or a holy scripture. The clear intention behind all of this is quite obviously to be on an equal footing with the Bible or with the Holy Scriptures that are supposed to be the sacred texts for the Christian Western world. You should understand by this, when you speak from the standpoint of a Chinese, the Western world is primarily America. Obviously, in so-called interreligious dialogues or interphilosophical or intercultural dialogue, what you have in front of the Chinese are Americans with their Bible always in their hand or on all the YMCA bedside tables. I even spoke about a project that seems to have been aborted, unfortunately, to have a sort of Confucian Bible for style YMCA. In other words, when you travel around the world, there would be a chance that on your bedside table, instead of finding the Gospels or the Bible, you would have a sort of Confucian Bible. I think that that project, for the time being, has been abandoned, but we will probably have to think about it. Last year, our revisit of Confucius, which started with the return of Confucius in China, ended with a return to Confucius. In other words, a return to the sources. When I say the sources, I'm speaking about the texts, of course. So far, we had covered about 4 centuries of rereading, reinterpretation, a European by the Americans and Europeans of Confucius and his Analects. So a genealogical endeavor where we moved and from perspectives, strategies, methodologies of all sorts, be they philological or philosophical. But there is one point where there remained a wide implicit consensus that until recent times has never been really called into question, neither by Chinese traditions nor by the various Western interpretations. I'm referring to a sort of Vulgate that I admit that I myself conveyed. I must say that the work that we have carried out together here at the Collège de France, for me, is also a matter of constantly calling into question everything I've said so far. And this is precisely what makes my work here interesting. So this popularized view, we could say it is based on 3 main preconceived ideas. The first preconceived idea is that the Lu Yu, which I put up here in Chinese characters and in P transcription here, is the only testimonial. This is the first preconceived idea. It is the only testimonial that we have that's authentic, genuine, about Confucius's teachings. As a result, we have the idea of an intrinsic link between this text, the Lu Yu, and the figure of Confucius, which has never really been called into question. The second preconceived idea is that the title of the book, the Lu Yu, is translated by way of conventions. For example, in the French language as Entretien, the Analects. This is the cover page of my own translation, Entretien de Confucius, which I translated, or in German by Gespräche. These are translations that represent the desire to understand the Lu Yu as a text of conversations or dialogues between Confucius and his disciples, or between Confucius and his contemporaries in general. The third preconceived idea is that the text of the Lu Yu is written by the very hands of Confucius, or at least by that of his disciples or subsequent disciples. According to our popular views, the Luyu is the result of notes that were taken of talks with Confucius by the disciples or subsequent disciples. This presupposes a link of continuity between the figure of Confucius and the text, the Luyu. It also implies that the text is dated to the days where Confucius was living. These are the dates that are traditionally attributed to him, 551 to 479. This text dates back at least to the days when Confucius was alive, in around the 5th century, or at least subsequent generations, somewhere between the 5th and the 4th centuries before the Christian era. In other words, this text is said to date back to a period that is well before the imperial age in 221 before Jesus Christ. In other words, by the first emperor Tishu Huangdi. These three preconceived ideas imply another underlying all three, a preconceived idea as regards a consistency or a unity in the text's composition. Here we find a general preconceived view that made it possible to have all the philosophical readings of the teachings of Confucius, which is supposed to be contained in the Luyu. And we have seen that these philosophical interpretations have prevailed since the very first translation of the Confucian corpus by the Jesuits in the 17th century, following on the Chinese critical commentary traditions. It is difficult indeed to claim to draw any philosophical lessons from a text if you consider that text as being composite, made of bits and pieces, and if you're not even sure that it may have been associated with a specific author. And yet, this is precisely how it may be radically called into question today in the eyes of some deconstructor historians, including the most radical of the lot, who defend a thesis described by our American colleagues themselves as a revisionist theory, where they entirely re-examine all the preconceived ideas in the reading of this text, meaning supposed relations between this text and Confucius that have been preserved so far. You will also note that tensions or an ideological opposition between reconstructors on the one hand and deconstructors on the other hand is all doubled by a disciplinary opposition between philosophers on the one hand and historians on the other. Philosophers, as a well-known fact, are on the side of the interpretative reconstruction, or since it's more chic to speak about hermeneutics of the text today, whereas historians do not hesitate to take the text and to take it to pieces, taking the text to pieces to examine meticulously with what type of bricks or stones the text was built. So this deconstruction effort of the text, the Liu, carried out mainly by historians and philologists, all of this was examined in our lectures last year. We have seen how the three preconceived ideas were called into question. The three preconceived ideas in popular opinion, as I just noted. If you come back to these three preconceived ideas, that leads to the following conclusions, deconstructionist conclusions. The Liu, first of all, is far from being the only source deemed to be genuine as regards the teachings of Confucius. They're not even certain that what was said to have been expressed directly and introduced by the canonical formula "Siyu," which means the master says, which we find regularly in the text of the Analects. It is not for sure that these words were necessarily to be attributed to Confucius. A revisionist, the most radical of the lot, would tell you that "Siyu" could quite simply mean "a master says." Who tells us that it's Confucius? Indeed. The second conclusion, linked to the second preconceived idea, is that contrarily to ideas that have been carried around for 2,000 years, it is not sure that the Liu is a collection of dialogues or interviews between Confucius and his disciples. There's nothing telling us that these are really dialogues. They may be reconstructed dialogues at best, or reinvented dialogues. And lastly, in response to the third preconceived idea, it is not for sure either that the Liu is the outcome of a direct transmission continuously through different disciples over the ages. So what is taken apart piece by piece in this deconstruction effort is nothing more or nothing less than the unity, consistency, and continuity of this text, considered at the same time by all of Chinese tradition as a founding text. Here, and we noted this last year, we're seeing an effort that is similar to that of the critical commentators of the biblical texts, which started in Europe in the 19th century, especially with the German critical interpreters, and on the text of the Gospel. And it was thinking of the famous person who was resurrected and whom we know of as Jesus Christ that I thought of by giving a title to my lecture this year, Confucius Resurrected. And drawing your attention to the question mark, because you can see that there are many questions, probably nothing but questions, and the fact that at the stage we have reached, in other words, the Confucius project, we can hardly do more than to issue a few assumptions. From Confucius Revisited to Confucius Resurrected, we're moving from a process of reinvention to a process of reconstruction. Both are equally contemporary, but with an opposite meaning. Because, of course, we, at the end of last year, were looking at a field of ruins. We're looking at a heap of bricks, totally ruined, a demolition ground. And we were examining what could we recover from these ruins. The Luyu, the text that we will see emerge this year, if we are fortunate, from the pile of spare parts, the deconstruction carried out last year, will not be exactly the consensual gospel that made the success of Mrs. Yudan, and the Confucius we will see emerge from its ashes, reborn from its ashes, will not have much to do with the triumphant and omnipresent icon as desired by Chinese soft power today. I will end with this other official picture of Confucius that you will find in all forms and shapes, a bit everywhere in China today. So thank you for attending our lecture today. I hope I will see you next week. I can only hope so. We will for an effort to resurrect Confucius. Thank you.